And I'm Nick Clark. This is Counter the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and economics. This week, the race for clean energy is gathering speed, but the technology to build green economies is mainly produced in China. Can the US and the EU catch up? Countries are looking to cut fossil fuels and boost clean energy. Could the change in energy systems reshape the global balance of power? And profiteering on clean air, property developers are marketing air quality products for the rich. Is the air we breathe becoming another luxury good? So then the race for clean energy is moving fast, and it could drive geopolitical rivalries and reshape the balance of power. As nations face up to the impacts of climate change, global spending on the transition to clean energy hit record highs last year. About $1.8 trillion was spent on installing renewable energy systems, buying electric cars and deploying other technologies. But it's nothing like enough. The world needs to invest well over double that to reach net zero emissions by mid-centuries. So which countries are pulling ahead? Well, when it comes to green investments, China is leading the pack with exactly $676 billion invested last year. That's twice as much as all EU countries combined and more than double that of the United States. Wind and solar energy, they're also soaring, particularly in the United States, and much of that is due to the Inflation Reduction Act, which pours billions of dollars in green investment. Africa is a key player in all of this, of course. It has about 30% of the world's critical mineral reserves, and most are needed to develop renewable technologies. From the Democratic Republic of Congo to Guinea and to Mozambique, the industry is just booming. But securing those minerals in the long term, well, that's an issue, especially for the European Union and the United States. China dominates most of the supply chains, and this could help it win geopolitical influence. Well, the shift towards renewable energy is global. Some developing nations are tapping into the market to secure their own supply and to attract wealthy investors. Katia Lopez-Hodian has more now.
Renewable energy is big business. This is one of the world's largest solar plants. Built in Morocco's southern city of Ouarzazate, it's part of a major plan to expand green energy. The desert's intense sunshine may soon be crucial to power homes in Morocco and beyond.
We have one of the largest storage facilities worldwide for such kind of technology that allow us to produce electricity from sun even during the evening for around 8 hours during the night.
Morocco wants to produce 10 gigawatts a year of electricity from renewable sources by 2030. It's also looking to generate enough electricity from renewables and export it to Europe, especially now that it's reducing its dependence on Russian gas imports.
This is really a game changer. I mean, countries which used to depend on oil imports, with the emergence of renewable energy, be it solar or wind, can now reduce their dependency on oil imports.
Bolivia is also shifting to cleaner energy. The South American country recently opened its first biofuel plant to curb gas imports. The president says more will follow.
Bolivia will now produce its own biofuel using the raw materials produced by the farming industry. This is important as we slowly reduce our dependency on foreign sources.
Bolivia has vast reserves of lithium. The mineral is widely seen as the green energy fuel of the future. Other countries and potential clients are taking notice. Mineral mining is an industry Africa knows all too well. For years, it supplied others with raw materials needed to develop renewable energy. China has invested heavily.
I signed a number of cooperation agreements with 8 Chinese companies to help us in the just energy transition, to ensure that we are able to exploit renewable resources, solar, wind. We're also looking forward to Chinese companies to also participating in our nuclear program.
For many countries, transitioning to renewable energy is no longer a matter of choice, but ultimately a necessity. Katia Lopez-Hodian, Al Jazeera, for Counting the Cost.
Well, for more on this, let's bring in our guests. Joining us from Brussels is Sandrine Dixon de Clèves. Sandrine is co-president of the Club of Rome and an international climate change thought leader. And we're in Nairobi as well. We have Mohammed Adow. He's director of Power Shift Africa, a climate and energy think tank. A warm welcome to you both. Sandrine, I'm going to start with you first, if I can. This shift to clean energy, it's underway. Ultimately, do you think, in the end, that this is going to change everything, akin to the arrival of the Industrial Revolution?
Well, it is absolutely the arrival of the Industrial Revolution. But the only problem that I would say is that as much progress as we've made, the state of the transition could potentially backtrack. We're seeing that because of fossil energy windfall profits of 2.8 billion per day, we're having a huge backtracking in terms of commitments from, first of all, energy producers, but also big multinational companies. So this could really have an impact in terms of the trajectory of the uptake of renewable energy.
Yeah, Mohammed, it's pretty evident that the transition is not going fast enough.
Yes, it's not going fast enough, and that is largely because there isn't much investment, and we have the fossil fuel, industry that has huge power, and they're actually able to hold back. But the good news is, everybody in this planet is coming to realize that climate change is real, it's rapid, and people realize that without action, the world is going to be in peril. So the growing concern among the public about the terrible impact of dirty energy is forcing politicians to act. And the other good thing, Nick, is renewable energy technology is getting cheaper and more efficient. And the fact that we've been able to harness, clean power from wind and sun is one of humanity's greatest achievements. And so as clean energy is getting cheaper all the time, I think the uptick and the deployment is going to accelerate over time.
OK, big strides being made, especially in China, Sandrine. China leading the way, would you say?
China is absolutely leading the way in terms of installed capacity. We're seeing about 1,453 gigawatts, which is a very big difference with the US in second place, around 388 gigawatts. We're also seeing that the EU is coming up in third place alongside Brazil. But I think what's most important is that with this installed capacity, we're also continuing to see investments in coal. We're also seeing that actually there could be some issues because of the impact of climate change. We're getting, in some places, for example, in Brazil, less hydropower. And these types of impacts are not taken into consideration. So the perversity of the market is the fact that actually climate could potentially also have huge impacts in terms of how much wind is actually blowing or not, or how much water we have or not due to climate impacts.
Yeah, very interesting. Mohammed, Sandrine mentioned China there and its reliance on coal. It's still heavily dependent. I think something like 58% of its energy comes from coal power.
That's true, and that's the biggest challenge the whole world faces. The vested interest of coal, oil, and gas companies have actually held back the transition. And these companies have got rich while the climate has suffered, and they want to continue to profit at our expense. But the good news is China is actually the biggest producer of wind and solar technology. They're trying to actually accelerate and reduce their dependence on coal. What we need is politicians across the world to see through these attempts by the fossil fuel industry and put the common good of the people of this planet before the interest of the fossil fuel corporations. I think we also need to see that countries are also investing much more in renewable energy. So China is investing in renewable energy. It's providing much more support to the developing countries, including to Africa. And so renewable energy, which doesn't have the big corporate backing of the oil and gas industry, needs more support from government, including those that have actually grown rich in part by polluting the planet without facing the cost of doing so.
Mohammed, how much of a problem is it for China to be dominating the renewable industry?
China is actually the biggest producer of wind and solar technology. They're also, interestingly, the biggest consumers of the key minerals and rare earth elements that are needed to make solar panels and other clean energy technology. So if I give you the example of Africa, the continent of Africa has 40% of these critical minerals. So this bounty needs to be managed carefully, and we need to avoid the exploitation of communities and workers in these industries. So the opportunity that we have, particularly given that we have the critical minerals that are needed for the decarbonization, is to actually help get those technologies to help global south and particularly Africa to be able to industrialize in a green manner. So we don't want to be the exporters of these raw materials that the global economy requires to decarbonize. And so it's clear that these minerals are valuable and they should actually be used to benefit our communities and countries, not just seized by private companies or by these big polluters. And so we have an opportunity to actually reorient the geopolitics of the transition in a way that we can actually lend support to some of the producers in a way that they can use it to deliver the sustainable energy access they require. 600 million Africans don't have access to electricity. 1 billion Africans don't have access to clean cooking. But this continent has 40% of the critical minerals that the world requires to decarbonize. And so if we continue to export them cheaply and then have to import the finished products, we wouldn't be able to actually leapfrog and become a green leader. So there's an opportunity to actually reorganize how the world looks at decarbonization and the kind of policies and investment that needs to be made available, particularly to Africa, so that we can boost renewable energy deployment, not just in China or in the West, but also in the developing countries. And that would require serious investment.
What you're talking about opens a window, of course, on another problem, which is accessing those crucial minerals, which are potentially a source of wealth for African nations and elsewhere in the world. But Sandrine also opens the window for potential environmental degradation to access them, to get at them, to mine them.
Yeah, I think there's a variety of different impacts that we're going to see, and also power shifts. And I fully agree with Mohammed that we absolutely need to support Africa in terms of a new type of economic development. But we do have to remember the ricochet effect of our shift in terms of the value chains. One is the power politics will completely change, and the influence of the whole shift towards renewable electrification will have a huge impact. We can see it through battery technology. We can also see it through renewables technology. But also, of course, it will create new dependencies. So how do we ensure that we don't get stuck in the same types of dependencies that we've had on Russian gas, for example? The other key issue is what type of financial structures do we put in place in order to enable Africa to truly be the leader? So what we've been working at the Club of Rome and also with our initiative Earth for All is to create the fiscal space. Because the fact of the matter is that Africa can't truly be part of the transition or much of the global south unless we enable debt cancellation, we put in place the right special drawing rights and fiscal assistance in order to enable them to truly become the leaders. This also means new types of partnerships with Europe, with the United States, and also with China. And from a European perspective, I personally believe that it's the moment to open up a totally new post-neo-colonial type of partnership with the African member states between Europe and Africa. Think about clean technologies and infrastructure and what that means for their economic development and also their export possibilities. Think through the environmental impacts and bring some of the knowledge across from Europe, but from other countries like Australia in terms of new mining technologies, and think through together how we can co-create this transition so that it actually does work for everyone.
Mohammed, one other thing I just want to ask you. Countries like the DRC in Africa have access to a huge amount of fossil fuel resources in the Congo Basin that they want to get at. They say they want to get at it, but the West is saying, no, you can't do that. Is the West right to say that?
Absolutely no. That is actually the hypocrisy of the West. Look at the biggest expansion of fossil fuels. It's actually happening in North America and particularly in the US. 80% of the planned expansion of fossil fuels is going to happen in the United States. Now, denying Congo and other developing countries the opportunity to use their resources without providing them a forward-looking and a forward-thinking climate policy that will allow them to leapfrog by sharing finance and technology is actually not going to cut through. I think the science is clear, and the moral case for action by all countries is clear. And we can actually also relate with the public concern because we're on the front line and we're suffering fast and worst the impact of climate change. But we can't take any more, this lecturing by the historic polluters who don't want to win themselves off fossil fuels and actually invest at the scale that the planet requires. I think there's an opportunity for DRC to live through that energy era, but that needs to be enabled and facilitated and supported by US and other historic polluters. We can also allow the US and Canada and Norway and those other historic polluters like the UK to continue expanding fossil fuels and lecturing DRC. I think there's an opportunity here for all of us to move at speed and help DRC and other African countries be able to actually take advantage of the huge wind and solar resources. Okay. But that can't come without investment, and it can't come with these historic polluters lecturing, DRC. I think we need to rethink and look at how we can actually unlock this potential for DRC and for the rest of the world.
Okay, to wrap this up, Sandrine, we're seeing a huge shift here, aren't we? How do you think this shift is going to change the balance of power? How's it going to affect the world geopolitically?
Well, it will completely change the balance of power, and some of the work that we've also been doing with the Energy Transition Commission, shows very clearly now that, as I said, our dependency on renewables coming from China, our dependency on minerals coming from Brazil, Africa, will mean that these will be the new energy players. But I think it's really important. We are at a tipping point here. We've seen the growth of renewables. We've seen the growth of the energy transition. And yet we're being told by energy producers recently, the fossil energy producers, that they're pulling out of their renewable investments. And this is incredibly problematic because it's actually giving a signal to the investment community that renewables are starting to get frozen. And that is meaning that actually private capital is not going to flow in the right direction. So I think it's incredibly important now that our leadership across the globe continues to stand behind a renewable energy transition, that, as Mohammed said, we have absolutely no choice. This is a planetary emergency. We're seeing the impacts of climate change across the globe as we speak. And so this is the time not to be fearful of the shift in geopolitics, but to think very clearly about what that might mean in terms of impacts and new relationships and new partnerships that we need to build so that we can truly all co-create this transition together. And that will depend on the real courage and the bravery of our leadership right now, not to start backtracking because they're fearful of the cost, because we've seen, as Mohammed said, and as we've seen through all of our analysis, that the parity now is here. The costs have gone down. It is the moment to shift.
Strong message from both of you. These are critical times. Sandrine Dixon de Clèves and Mohammed Adel, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Of course, we all breathe the same air, and pollution is a universal problem that can lead to serious health issues. But money can play an important role in people's exposure to clean air. Rich people have the resources to manage pollution and purchase air purifiers, among other products. The real estate market is tapping into that potential. But the environmental inequality is not just between households. The quality of air also differs from locally, from one street to another, and internationally, between countries. Imogen Kimber has this.
Clean air is the most basic necessity for human life. But even this is not available equally. In Europe, the air is getting cleaner, while in South and Southeast Asia, pollution is increasing. And of the 6.7 million air pollution-associated deaths per year, the majority of them are in Asia and Africa.
This is driven by a range of things, from different ways of generating energy, and also our global system that means that lots of these countries are producing products that are sent to the global north and wealthier countries.
Urbanisation, emission-emitting transportation, and agricultural methods like burning of crops are other factors. But there is also inequality within a city, from street to street, or even between households.
People with lower socioeconomic status tend to live in areas with higher levels of traffic, for example, or close to industrial activities. In work conditions, you have a much more likely probability to work outdoors if you are a poor person, or in places that are affected by air pollution.
While a person on a lower income may need to cycle to work, exposing themselves to pollution, a person with a higher income can use an air-conditioned car. They will also likely have air conditioning or air purifiers in their homes, while people on very low incomes may not even have glass in their windows. And cooking is a major factor. With 2.3 billion people around the world, only being able to afford using heating methods that are creating pollutants in their own homes, like open coal fires or kerosene. In fact, real estate developers have begun offering clean air as a feature, and some new apartment blocks have advanced filtration systems built in. In the US, these homes are at least 20% more expensive than the equivalent without. Although studies show that in the US, divisions are not only along economic lines, but also racial.
If you're black or African American person in North America, you are exposed to 1.5 times the amount of particulate matter that you might be exposed to if you're from a different community or the population as a whole.
According to experts, tackling air pollution needs policy change on a global, regional and national level, rather than potentially exacerbating inequality with bubbles of clean air. Imogen Kimber, AlJazeera, for Counting the Cost.
All right, let's get into this now with Abhir Bala, who joins us from New Delhi. He's an environmentalist and youth advisor for the Commonwealth Human Ecology Council. Welcome to Counting the Cost, Abhir. Tell us more about this growing business of indoor air quality and just how big the market is.
Thanks. Great to be here. Well, there is definitely a growing market for indoor air quality when it comes to clean air, because there are several factors driving this, whether it's the severe outdoor pollution that we see in Delhi and the rest of the northern Gangetic Plain in India. And in turn, this pollution drives health concerns, both in the short term and the long term. And of course, after COVID, we've seen that people have become more aware of the importance of healthy environments. People are more aware that, that there can be transmission risks, even airborne. And of course, that there is a buzz that is being generated today around the fact that India is one of the most polluted countries in the world when it comes to air quality. And, let's talk numbers. I mean, if we look at indoor air quality, the air quality inside homes, especially during the winter, was found to be 15% worse than the air outside.
Okay, so given that's a big figure, isn't it? So is this technology, is it good enough to deal with that kind of problem?
There is technology, but as your video also pointed out, it's inaccessible to most people. 80 to 90% of India, for example, cannot afford an air purifier because their average household income for the month would be around 20,000, whereas even the cheapest air purifier costs around 5,000 to 7,000 rupees.
So how long do you think it'll take for this technology to trickle down to the poorer communities?
Well, at least a couple of years, and I don't think the solution lies only in the technology, right? There needs to be a systemic change when it comes to the enforcement of policies. In India and the rest of the developing world, vehicular emissions are the primary contributor to air pollution. So we need to have that shift towards public transport, green hydrogen. So the short answer to your question is a minimum of 5 to 7 years. But again, the answer is not just in the technology, but also in the enforcement of public policies and rules.
And how far is the Indian government down the path of making that shift, of making the transition to renewables?
At the G20, which we hosted in October last year, we committed that we would triple renewables by 2030. And I'm proud to say that we're well on track to meet that target. But at the same time, I think there are measures which are being taken by state governments as well as the central government, which are more of an eyewash, if I may call it that. For example, we have outdoor air purification systems which are being tested in Delhi for the last couple of years. But there are innumerable studies that say that, with the quantum of Delhi's air pollution being as high as it is, something like an outdoor air purifier is simply ineffective, right? So we also need to make the shift from talking about the fact that the government is introducing changes to actually having ground level, actionable, tangible solutions.
Yeah, of course, breathing clean air is a human right, isn't it? How can we ensure that people across the world, poor people across the world, have that human right that is more accessible to the rich?
Well, the first part is eliminating it at the source, right? We need to, with poor households, we have the main source of indoor air pollution is cooking fuel, whether it's kerosene, whether it's wood, whether it's coal, right? So we need to ensure that greener cooking fuels, whether it's LPG, whether it's biogas, is being supplied within the houses. Maybe moving to solar cookers or induction cookers, and then eventually also ensuring that access to cleaner air is provided by providing households and then by providing cleaner air purification systems within those households. And I'm proud to say that there are several Indian startups today, such as Earth and such as Pran, which are working on affordable solutions backed by corporate CSR to make cleaner air more accessible to several sections of several economically weaker sections of society.
And there's, of course, a role for developed nations to stump up that long-promised cash to help developing nations improve air quality.
Absolutely. I mean, we saw that at COP28. I was there on the ground. The $100 billion, the infamous $100 billion commitment had to be met in 2019, but it was only implemented as late as 2023. So, of course, we need to ensure that we're putting our money and actions, and by our, I mean, the developed world needs to ensure that their actions and money is where their mouth is at. But at the same time, I think several good solutions are being introduced, such as, this year at COP28, we saw the Health and Climate Bill, which was passed. Unfortunately, India was not a signatory to that, but that is definitely a step in the right direction to acknowledging how things like air pollution contribute significantly towards, deteriorating health.
Good to have your thoughts up here. Bala there.
Thank you.
And that is our show for this week. Do get in touch with us on X, formerly known as Twitter, at Nick Clark, AlJazz, and do use the hashtag AJC2C when you get in touch. Or drop us an email, countingthecost at aljazeera.net is our address. Plenty more for you online at aljazeera.com/CTC. That'll take you straight to our page, which is individual reports, links to entire episodes for you to catch up on. That's it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Nick Clark from the whole team. Thanks for joining us. The news on Al Jazeera is coming right up.